I taste metal before I find the words for it, a thin sting that makes me swallow twice, and listen to my own breathing as if it belongs to someone else, and all I can think is how quiet this house gets when it wants to hide the truth. My name is Nora Bennett, 31, and I have trained my voice to sound calm on command, even when the floor shifts under me. Most nights I finish rounds and drive home along the river windows cracked, telling myself peace is a practice you build, not a gift you're handed. Tonight the lights in our kitchen are too bright, the air too cold, and the silence carries the weight of what we never say. I pull off my coat, set my tote on the chair, and hear a drawer slide where no drawer should be. The laundry door is open, a faint draft rising from the stairwell, and a shadow moves at the edge of the basement light. There are 14 steps down to the concrete, and I've counted them enough times to know exactly how far a body can fall. I tell myself to breathe, to ask a simple question to keep my hands steady. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever kept the peace so long that you forgot what your own voice sounds like. I grew up in a town where we waved at the mail carrier brought casseroles when a neighbor got bad news, and learned early that kindness starts in the small, boring ways no one applauds. My mother, Mary Ann, taught me to write thank you notes without being asked, and my father, Gerald, taught me to treat every patient like someone's whole world was sitting in that chair. On Sundays, we lined up in the pew near the back, and afterward my mother would press pie into the hands of anyone who lingered while my father talked shop with half the congregation, a man you didn't argue with unless you had the data to back it up. We did not have much extra when I was little, but we had enough, and my parents made it clear that work was the shared language of this family. Keep your head down, excel, and let your results speak for you. I believed them so completely that I carried those rules into my 20s like a second spine through college, then medical school, then the long nights of residency when you measure time in cups of coffee and the number of rooms still waiting on you. When I matched at the hospital, where my father's name hangs on a plaque, I told myself to earn it twice, once with my hands, once with my silence. The first long crack in that silence didn't look like trouble at the time. It looked like convenience. After med school, when the cheapest safe apartment near the hospital still ate most of my paycheck, my parents offered the family house as a landing place until my schedule steadied. I took the smaller upstairs room and told myself it was temporary, a sensible bridge between one hard season and the next. What I didn't say out loud was that my sister Haley had never needed bridges. Doors opened for her, people smiled for her, and if something went wrong, the story adjusted to make it right. Haley was 2 years out of college with a spotless resume and a way of turning every favor into a compliment for the person who gave it, so no one saw the messes that collected behind her. Least of all my father, who loved a winner and preferred not to look beneath a glossy surface. My mother smoothed the space between us like she smoothed tablecloths before company, convinced that harmony was proof of love. At the hospital, I moved through the halls with a rhythm I trusted. Check labs lay a hand on a shoulder. Listen longer than the chart suggests, and most days that rhythm followed me home. But there were nights when I would stand in our driveway and sit in the car a few minutes longer, both hands on the wheel, calming my breath before stepping into a kitchen where every detail looked perfect. The copper pot polished the counter clean. My father's cufflinks set beside his briefcase like small pieces of armor. That kind of order has a sound, a hush, that can feel safe until you realize it also swallows words that do not flatter the room. My mother learned to talk in the soft space around that hush. I learned to trim a sentence until it fit. I am not naive about money or status in a hospital with marble floors. I know how donors can tilt a conversation, how last names can open doors you didn't even know were there. My father's influence reaches further than mine, and I understood early that the wise thing, the strategic thing, was to avoid making him choose between his pride and my version of the truth. So I mapped my days around the places with fewer sparks, offered help, thanked everyone, and kept moving. If something went missing, I replaced it. If a story didn't match, I let it pass. If Haley's mess knocked into my schedule, I patched it and kept my mouth shut, because people who never cause trouble get to keep their footing, and I had patience to see at 5 a.m. The night the air in the kitchen felt wrong, I just finished an 11-hour shift that started before dawn, and my brain was still half inside a room where a woman's blood pressure finally stabilized. My tote was heavy with charts to review, and my phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Dana Pierce reminding me to sleep while I could, a kindness I cherished, because she never gave it with strings attached. I set the phone down and heard that thin, unmistakable slide of a drawer, the sound of fingers moving where they shouldn't, and the small, quick laugh of someone too sure of herself. My mother's slippers were on their mat by the door. My father's car wasn't in the driveway yet. The house breathed in that odd, patient way it has when it's waiting for someone to decide what story we are going to tell. I crossed the kitchen and touched the laundry door with 2 fingers, as if the wood could tell me what waited below. The basement light cast a narrow stripe across the first few steps, and beyond it, a movement stilled, as if sound alone could erase a fact. I said Haley's name, not loudly, not accusing, just the way you say it, when you want to believe the answer will be simple. Her shadow shifted. Then a shape turned, and the corner of our father's wallet, his initials stamped in worn gold, caught the light like a question that already knew its answer. There are 14 steps to the concrete, and I knew each one by heart. I also knew what came next if I pretended not to see. So I took a breath, set my hand on the banister we installed together when I was 16, and stepped down into the kind of truth that doesn't leave room for a nicer version. The banister felt solid under my hand, but the air behind me shifted faster than I could turn. Haley's grip pressed into my shoulders, sharp and certain, and the floor gave way. 14 stairs carried me down in a rush of motion and pain, each impact driving air from my lungs, until the concrete stopped me cold. A sharp taste filled my mouth as I tried to breathe, ribs burning every time I moved. Above me her voice called out with sudden concern, but the echo of her push clung to my skin. "Nora," she said, her tone light, as though she had only found me there. Footsteps pounded across the floorboards, and shadows crowded the doorway. My mother rushed down first, slippers, sliding across the concrete, her eyes wide as she bent near me. My father appeared behind her, his broad frame blocking the light, his expression shifting quickly from worry to suspicion. "What happened?" he demanded, his gaze flicking between me and Haley. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain sliced through my side, leaving me gasping. "She pushed," I said, my voice unsteady. "I didn't," Haley interrupted quickly, stepping forward before my words settled in the air. "She tripped carrying laundry. You know how clumsy she is." My father's stare landed hard on me. "Is that what happened, Nora?" he asked, his voice measured. I met his eyes, but before I could answer, my mother's face told me what he expected. She dropped her gaze to the floor, lips pressed tight. It was the same silent warning I'd seen all my life: do not contradict him. "We'll handle this at home," my father said firmly, his tone allowing no argument. "No hospitals." The words sank into me like a second fall. I knew what handling it at home meant. Months earlier, when Haley had thrown a book that split my scalp open, my father had stitched it himself in the downstairs bathroom, his grip so tight on my arm that I bit my lip to keep from crying out. My mother had whispered later in the kitchen, "Just keep your head down until residency is over. 2 more years, Nora. Just 2 more years. 2 more years of accidents. 2 more years of silence." But tonight every breath came jagged, my chest shifting wrong beneath my palm. "I can't breathe properly," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need medical attention." My father leaned down, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "What you need is to stop making a scene. We have company coming for dinner." My hand trembled as I reached for my phone, still in my pocket. For once, I didn't stop myself. "I'm calling Aunt Ruth." I said the words, tasting new on my tongue. His expression flickered, a flash of something I couldn't name before it hardened again. My mother's voice broke through the standoff. "I'm taking her to the ER, she said, suddenly surprising us both. My father blocked the doorway, crossing his arms. "Fine," he said slowly. "But Nora, you tripped carrying laundry. That's what happened. Say anything else, and you can forget about our support during residency." The threat landed heavy, as it always did. Rent, groceries, even gas for my car. Without their help, my residence salary would barely cover the basics. From behind him, Haley's voice rose smooth and careless. "Daddy, will this affect my internship? My record can't have any complications." Her meaning was clear. She would remain untouchable no matter what it cost me. My mother helped me to my feet, the room tilting as pain blurred the edges of my vision. My father's hand gripped my elbow, steadying me, but reminding me of the weight behind his words. Each step up the stairs was heavy with the knowledge that this family would protect its own image long before it protected me. In the hospital 20 minutes later, the fluorescent lights hummed above me as Dr. Dana Pierce's hands moved carefully along my side. "These are fingerprints, Nora," she said gently, "not from a fall." I kept my eyes on the ceiling tiles, counting them to steady my breath. X-rays glowed on the wall, showing 4 fractured ribs, a hairline break in my wrist, and shadows of old injuries hidden beneath. "See these calcified areas? Previous fractures? Multiple," she explained. I let the tears fall into my hairline without moving to wipe them away. "Did someone push you?" she asked, her voice steady but kind. I nodded, and something deep inside me gave way. "I'm required to report suspected abuse," she said softly. "Hospital security will be outside your door." The word abuse seemed too big for what I had lived, yet not big enough. The door opened, and my parents filled the room. My father stood tall at the foot of my bed. My mother fussed with flowers she'd brought, and Haley leaned near the window, her gaze on her polished nails. Dr. Pierce straightened clipboard firm in her hands. "These injuries are inconsistent with a simple fall," she said clearly. "The pattern indicates force." My father's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting someone in this family hurt her?" "I'm stating medical facts," Dr. Pierce replied. "And the X-rays show multiple fractures in various stages of healing." "This is absurd," he snapped, lowering his voice to that dangerous calm I knew too well. "I sit on this hospital's board. I've contributed heavily to the pediatric wing. Perhaps you should consider your position before making unfounded claims." Dr. Pierce didn't flinch. "My position is as her physician, not as your employee." "She's always been clumsy," my mother offered, quickly rearranging the flowers again. "She falls all the time." Haley let out a short laugh. "And if something did happen, maybe she deserved it. Always acting perfect." The words fell into silence, sharp and cutting. Dr. Pierce wrote briskly on her clipboard. "You just admitted to assault," she said without looking up. My father stepped forward. "She said no such thing. This conversation is over." He turned to me, lowering his voice. "Nora, this story of yours puts your residency at risk. What hospital wants a doctor who invents abuse? If this becomes public, your career is finished before it begins." The threat pressed down on me with familiar weight. He wasn't finished. "And without our support, you'll be homeless. Your salary barely covers food, let alone rent." My mother placed her hand lightly over mine. "Sweetheart, please. This is a misunderstanding." Dr. Pierce cleared her throat. "Untreated injuries like this can lead to permanent damage. Medical consequences don't disappear just because they're inconvenient." Her words reached me in a way none of theirs did. I thought of how many consequences I had already carried in silence, how many scars I had hidden beneath sleeves and explanations. The knock at the door broke the moment. A woman with short gray hair and a badge stepped in. "Detective Olivia Hart," she said, nodding at the room before turning to me. "I'd like to speak with Nora alone." My father moved to object, but she didn't waver. "Hospital security will escort you to the waiting area." For the first time in years, someone in authority chose me over him. As the door closed behind them, Detective Hart sat beside me. She didn't rush, she didn't push, she simply waited as I found my voice. And for the first time, I told the truth from beginning to end. I knew when my family returned, they would try again to smother it. But something had shifted. Sitting there with my side wrapped and my words finally written down, I understood the choice before me: security with silence or freedom with risk. And as the clock on the wall ticked steady in the quiet, I realized the story of what happened at the bottom of those stairs was only beginning. When the detective closed her notebook and left my hospital room that night, silence filled the space where my family's voices had been. For the first time, no one was speaking for me. The quiet was heavy, almost foreign, but I clung to it. My ribs ached with every breath my wrist wrapped in plaster, and yet what lingered most was the certainty that my father would not let this rest. I didn't have to wait long to see it unfold. The following week, an email circulated among the residency staff, an emergency board meeting scheduled at dawn, chaired by men whose names I knew well. My father's influence stretched across every page disguised in formal language. The topic, written in neat, bureaucratic code, was patterns of diagnostic overreach. Everyone knew it meant Dr. Pierce. When she stopped by my station that morning, her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed her anger. "Your father works fast," she said under her breath. I lowered my gaze, guilt pressing down on me, but she touched my arm lightly. "This isn't because of you. It's because of him." Her steadiness kept me upright through the rest of that shift, even as whispers followed me down the hallway. Nurses lowered their voices when I passed. Conversations shifted mid-sentence. More than once I caught someone's pitying glance, the kind that said they had already decided my story. In the break room, I found a pamphlet left on top of my bag, the kind handed out during wellness seminars. Someone had circled the word delusions in red ink. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my notebook, another record among the rest. Days bled into nights as I tried to secure housing I could afford on my own. Each stairwell I climbed sent sharp pains shooting through my ribs, and each apartment I toured demanded more rent than I could manage. In the end, I paid cash for a week at a low-cost motel near the freeway, the air thick with industrial cleaner and stale cigarettes. The clerk handed me my key, with a look that said she didn't need to ask questions. "Leaving somebody, honey," she said softly. I nodded, and the words caught in my throat. Every evening after my shifts, I returned to that narrow room, its thin curtains drawn against the neon sign outside. I curled around my ribs, willing my body to heal faster than time allowed. When the phone rang, it was my mother. Her voicemails alternated between pleading and blaming, each message reminding me of the damage I was doing to our family. I saved them all. At the hospital, small acts of sabotage crept into my schedule. One morning, the chief resident handed out assignments and gave me 6 consecutive overnight shifts. My voice stayed calm as I asked for the change to be corrected, but I set my phone on the table to record his response. He avoided my eyes and muttered about clerical errors. Behind him, I saw my father stride past the glass doors, and the pieces fit together too neatly. Later in the locker room, my hands shook as I tried to work the combination lock. The adrenaline crash left me lightheaded, my forehead pressed to the cool metal. When I finally opened the door, a paper bag rested on top of my folded scrubs. Inside was a cup of coffee still warm and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. A sticky note written in Dr. Pierce's neat hand read, "Some days we just need to be reminded we're not fighting alone. Your courage matters." I sat on the bench and ate slowly, letting the taste steady me. Some afternoons when the hospital quieted, I slipped into the chapel. I didn't pray, not exactly. I just sat in the back pew listening to the hush that wasn't waiting for anyone's permission. One day, as I rose to leave, the door opened and my mother stepped inside. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her purse clutched like a shield. She slid onto the bench beside me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can't you just say you were confused?" she pleaded. "Your father built this life for us." I turned toward her, each movement pulling at my ribs. "He built a life where Haley could hurt me without consequence," I said. The words came clearer than I expected. "I'll talk to him," she promised quickly. "If you drop the charges, things can go back to normal. We can be a family again." I stood slowly watching her face crumble. "I became a doctor to protect people," I said. "I can't do that if I can't even protect myself." She looked at me as though I had broken something sacred, but for once I didn't shrink from her disappointment. The next week blurred with more late shifts and more hushed stares. I carried a notebook everywhere, documenting each exchange with dates and times. My phone filled with recordings and voicemails, every scrap of evidence I could hold on to. At night, I laid the pages out on the motel desk, the cheap lamp flickering as if even the room was tired. Each note was another stitch in a record too complete to deny, still doubt pressed in like damp air. What if my father's threats proved true? What if the residency board believed his version of me unstable, dramatic, unreliable? Each whisper in the hall reminded me how easily a career could be ruined by the people who controlled the story. One evening as I left the hospital, the sky low and heavy with rain, I felt the sharp divide between two paths. I could step back into silence, accept their conditions, and keep the shelter of my father's name. Or I could keep moving into the storm carrying nothing but a folder of evidence and a voice no one wanted to hear. The rain began to fall as I crossed the parking lot, soaking through my coat. I paused, my keys in my hand, and felt the weight of the choice pressing closer. Somewhere between the motel and the hospital, between silence and truth, I knew I would have to decide which part of me to keep. And as thunder rolled low over the city, I understood that the walls closing in weren't just my family's anymore. They belonged to everyone who had chosen to look away. That was the night I realized the fight would not stay private for long. The rain was steady the night I dialed Aunt Ruth's number from the motel parking lot. My chest tightened as the phone rang, but she answered on the first. "I've been waiting to hear from you," she said, her voice calm and sure. I swallowed hard before asking if I could stay just until I figured things out. She didn't hesitate. "My guest room is yours. I've already made up the bed." When I warned her that my father would try to turn people against her too, her voice turned firm. "Let him try. I've been keeping records for years. He might be surprised by what I have." The admission left me blinking in the dark, my fingers tightening on the phone. I drove through the rain until I reached her front porch. She opened the door before I knocked, warm light spilling around her. "You're home now," she said, taking both my hands as if she had been waiting a long time. The next morning, her kitchen table transformed into a war room. We spread out folders and binders across the oak surface. Medical records sat in neat piles, each matched with photographs of injuries. Ruth handed me a thick binder, her handwriting precise across every page. She had recorded dates, times, and the explanations my parents had given for each incident. "You've been documenting this long?" I asked quietly. "I tried to report once," she said, her lips pressed thin. "Your father convinced them I was just jealous, so I kept records waiting for when you were ready." Her patience felt like a lifeline, each page in that binder proof that the years had not been imagined away. That afternoon, Detective Hart called. Her tone was steady, measured, but I could hear the weight behind her words. "We're filing charges against Haley. The DA believes we have enough to make assault with intent stick." My hand tightened on the phone. "And my parents?" I asked. She paused. "The investigation is ongoing. The long-term pattern is concerning." Later, I sat in Julia Park's office, her desk covered with our growing timeline. She laid out each piece, carefully lining up photos with medical charts, notes with witness statements. 15 documented incidents in 5 years, she said, tapping the stack. "It's a strong case." For the first time since the fall down those stairs, I felt my spine straighten. My father struck back quickly. Dr. Lawson called me into his office, his face drawn. He explained that my father had contacted the board, suggesting my presence might disrupt hospital operations. My stomach dropped at the words "years of work" flashing before my eyes. I braced for dismissal. Instead, Dr. Lawson folded his hands and said, "I'm placing you on paid medical leave with full benefits until this is resolved. Gerald Bennett doesn't control this department." I blinked back tears I hadn't expected. He had chosen fairness over fear. 2 days later, Haley appeared in the hospital lobby while I was there to collect research materials. Security intercepted her before she reached me. "I just want to talk to my sister," she shouted, her voice echoing through the atrium. Officer Sanchez stepped between us, firm but calm. "Ma'am, you're violating a restraining order." Haley's face twisted, her words tumbling into anger, but she was let out before she could reach me. The next morning, Julia sent me a message. The judge had added stricter conditions to Haley's release, including an expanded no-contact order. Reading the words, I exhaled for the first time in days. At a medical conference later that week, I spotted 2 board members who had always stood close to my father. They saw me, exchanged a look, and turned away quickly. The shift was small, but I felt it ripple. When Julia asked if I wanted to pursue maximum penalties, I hesitated. The question lingered, would justice mean seeing them punished, or was it enough to walk free from their control? Support came from places I hadn't expected. Dr. Pierce organized a set of sworn statements from colleagues across departments, each one attesting to my professional conduct and the injuries they had noticed over time. We saw the bruises, she told me gently. The makeup didn't hide everything. Their signatures felt like a wall standing behind me. Ruth met with the prosecutor and handed over her years of documentation. This is exactly the pattern evidence we needed, the prosecutor told her. The timeline grew longer and more undeniable, each line another fracture in my father's story. Messages began arriving from fellow residents. Whatever shifts you need covered, I'm there. Take all the time you need. Their words filled the silence where whispers had once been. Then came the news I hadn't expected. The hospital board convened an emergency session to review my father's conduct. His attempts to pressure colleagues on my case were now under ethics review. He was temporarily removed from his committee assignments. The same influence he had always wielded now stood as evidence against him. At brunch with Ruth that Sunday, my phone lit up with my mother's number. I let it ring through, but minutes later Ruth's phone rang instead. She listened, her face softening. "Elizabeth, calm down. Yes, she's here." "No, I don't think that's a good idea right now." When she hung up, she looked at me carefully. "Your mother says she made mistakes. She's crying." I stared out the window, the words circling in my mind. 30 years of silence, wrapped now in a few trembling apologies. The court date was only a week away. The thought of facing them all, my father, my mother, my sister, made my chest tighten. But when I caught my reflection in Ruth's hallway mirror, I noticed the difference. My shoulders no longer curved inward. My eyes didn't drop. For the first time, I felt the ground under me as steady as the evidence stacked on Ruth's table. The day was coming when I would face them not as the daughter they controlled, but as a woman standing with proof, with allies, and with a voice that finally carried weight. And as that realization settled over me, I understood the fight ahead would not just determine the outcome of one courtroom, but the shape of every day that followed. The courthouse date was close, and the pressure around me grew sharper each day. My father worked the phones and the corridors, trying to tilt every angle of my life back into his control. My mother called Ruth's house repeatedly, leaving messages that mixed guilt with pleas for reconciliation. Even Haley attempted to slip notes through colleagues, small scraps of handwriting that landed in my locker despite the order against her. I focused on what I could hold steady, my records, my voice, the people who chose to stand beside me. Julia reminded me often, paper trails are louder than whispers. Together we prepared each document with precision, every injury and every manipulation set in black and white. It wasn't long before my father made another attempt. Dr. Lawson called me back into his office, his expression carefully neutral. "Your father believes your continued presence disrupts hospital morale," he said. I braced myself for another blow, but Lawson kept his gaze level. "The board doesn't speak for me. You will not be dismissed." Relief came so quickly I had to grip the chair's armrest. 2 days later, I returned briefly to the hospital to collect research materials. I hadn't expected to see Haley standing in the lobby. Her eyes found mine instantly, and she started toward me, her voice carrying across the polished floor. "I just want to talk to my sister," she called. Security intercepted her before she reached me. Officer Sanchez positioned himself firmly between us. "Ma'am, you're violating a restraining order," he said. Haley's face twisted, her voice climbing into fury, but they escorted her out. The next morning, Julia's text appeared on my phone. The judge had extended the conditions of Haley's release, increasing the distance she was required to keep. Reading it, I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time in weeks. That week, a medical conference drew doctors from across the city. I walked into the crowded lobby and immediately noticed 2 board members who had always backed my father. When they spotted me, their conversation faltered. They exchanged a glance and turned quickly in the other direction. The change was small, but I felt it ripple outward like a crack forming in stone. Back at Ruth's, I sorted through binders and folders late into the night. She brewed tea and stayed near her presence, quiet but steady. "Every page makes it harder for him to deny," she said, sliding another envelope toward me. Inside were her meticulous notes spanning years of so-called accidents. I thought about all the times she had been dismissed, her warnings cast aside, and realized how long she had been waiting for me to be ready. Support began arriving in ways I hadn't expected. Dr. Pierce delivered a folder filled with sworn statements from colleagues across departments. Each one described moments when they'd seen bruises I tried to hide, or shifts where my injuries made tasks difficult. "We've all noticed," she told me gently. "Now we're putting it on record." My phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow residents. "Whatever you need covered, I'll do it. Don't worry about schedules, just focus on healing." Their words steadied me against the undercurrent of whispers that still followed me down some hallways. For the first time, I wasn't standing completely alone inside those walls. The prosecutor's office moved quickly, building the case with Ruth's binder as the backbone. Julia explained that the timeline of 23 incidents spread across 8 years painted a clear picture of escalation. "This isn't isolated," she said, pointing to the board covered in dates. "This is pattern evidence." While the case gained momentum, my father made one more calculated move. He arranged a meeting in a hospital conference room the day before our court date. My mother sat beside him, adjusting her necklace over and over, her fingers trembling. My father slid a manila folder across the table. "We can resolve this quietly," he said, his voice calm and professional. "Your tuition, your expenses, a stipend, everything you need to move forward." I didn't touch it. Weeks ago I might have, but instead I opened my own envelope and pushed it across the table. Inside were letters from the hospital administration, clearing me of any professional concerns. Another document confirmed the medical director's offer of a fully funded research position after residency. My father's jaw tightened as he scanned the signatures. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "I don't need your money," I said quietly. "I never did." My father leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "You're making a terrible mistake." "No," I answered, my words steady. "I'm correcting one." I rose from the table and walked toward the door, each step firm against the marble floor. My mother's voice called after me, breaking into tears, but I didn't look back. For the first time, I didn't need to. The next morning, I would sit across from them in court, not as their daughter pressed into silence, but as a witness with proof in my hands. And as I stepped into the elevator that day, I knew the moment of truth was finally coming. The courtroom felt colder than I expected, the high ceiling stretching above us, the tall windows letting in streams of pale light. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Ruth on one side and Dr. Pierce on the other, their presence steadier than the chair beneath me. Across the aisle, Haley sat with her head down, twisting her hands in her lap. My father leaned toward their attorney, speaking in low, urgent tones, while my mother stared at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. When the judge called my name, I rose and walked forward. Each step carried the weight of years, but for once my legs didn't falter. I raised my hand, repeated the oath, and took the stand. The courtroom hushed as the prosecutor asked me to describe what had happened. I began with the night of the basement stairs, the fingerprints on my ribs, the fractures that brought me to the ER. My voice stayed even as I spoke the words no longer trapped inside me. One by one, the prosecutor guided me through the years of incidents I had recorded. The medical textbook hurled at my head, the kitchen burns explained away as clumsiness, the fractures dismissed as accidents. Dr. Pierce's images appeared on the screens, X-rays of bones broken in different stages of healing, photographs of bruises that formed patterns no fall could explain. The silence in the room thickened with each page. When the prosecutor asked why I had chosen to come forward now, I looked across the aisle and spoke directly. "Because doctors are meant to protect people who can't protect themselves," I said, "and that includes me. The defense attempted to break me, pressing on my supposed instability, my father's contributions to the hospital, Haley's spotless record. But the evidence held. The more they pushed, the more the paper trail spoke for itself. The murmurs in the gallery shifted, no longer pity, but something closer to recognition. Haley's collapse came when the prosecutor presented a series of messages she had sent to friends in the days before my fall. The words were blunt, her anger plain. "She always looks so perfect. I'll make sure she slips up for once." Haley buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she whispered, "I just wanted her to fail at something." My father stood abruptly, his face flushed, his voice cutting across the judges. "This is absurd. My daughter is being misrepresented." He was cut off by the judge's sharp rebuke. "Sit down, Mr. Bennett, or you will be held in contempt." The authority in her tone silenced even him. He sank back into his seat, the flush in his cheeks darkening as the room watched. When the judge delivered her ruling, her voice carried no hesitation. A full protection order against my entire family, additional charges for Haley, and a clear statement from the bench. This court takes a dim view of those who use influence to enable abuse, particularly within a family. Dr. Bennett's evidence demonstrates a pattern this court cannot ignore. The sound of the gavel cracked through the room like a release of pressure. I felt the weight shift off my shoulders, the years of silence breaking at last. Outside, the sun was brighter than I remembered warming my face as Ruth squeezed my hand. Reporters clustered near the steps, their microphones raised, but Detective Hart stepped in quietly. "We'll avoid them for now," she said. "There will be time for statements later." She shared news of the sentencing recommendations, probation counseling, and community service for Haley, while my parents faced consequences in their professional and social lives that were already beginning to unravel. As we turned to leave, I caught sight of my mother standing alone at the edge of the crowd. She looked smaller without my father at her side. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a mark circling her wrist, partially hidden by her bracelet. Fear flickered in her expression, the same fear I had carried for years. It lingered between us, unspoken but undeniable, before I turned away. In the weeks that followed, the consequences deepened. My father was stripped from his hospital board assignments, colleagues distancing themselves from him with each passing day. Invitations vanished, doors that once opened for him now firmly closed. My mother moved into an apartment across town, her voice unsteady when she left messages with Ruth, not asking forgiveness, but admitting she was finally in therapy. I spent my mornings at Ruth's kitchen table preparing notes for conferences, the evidence that once documented my breaking now serving as teaching tools for others. My ribs had healed by then, but I still caught myself pressing my side when tension rose, as if reminding myself of the cost already paid. When I stood at the front of a lecture hall, weeks later, presenting on recognizing patterns of abuse in patients, the faces watching me stayed intent. "The signs are often there," I told them. Injuries explained with stories that don't fit, multiple fractures in different stages, fear that silences the truth. In the back row, Ruth held up her phone to record her pride, shining clear. As the applause filled the hall, I thought of how far the truth had carried me and how much further it still had to go. For the first time, I wasn't speaking to defend myself. I was speaking to protect others. And when I stepped down from the stage, Dr. Pierce pressed my hand lightly and said, "You've turned the record into something stronger than their silence." The fight that had once been about survival was now becoming something more. The courtroom had delivered its judgment, but the path ahead was mine to shape. And as I left the conference hall that day, I knew the next step was no longer about proving what happened. It was about choosing how to live beyond it. In the weeks after the trial, the weight of the gavel's echo followed me everywhere. For the first time in years, silence no longer pressed against me. It stretched out like space I had never been allowed to claim. The protection order was in place, Haley was bound by her conditions, and my father's influence had been reduced to whispers of his downfall. Yet every step forward reminded me of what it had cost to stand. Hospital corridors shifted in ways I hadn't expected. Colleagues who once avoided me now stopped to ask how I was healing. A handful offered their homes for dinner or sent notes tucked into my locker, proof that I wasn't invisible anymore. Dr. Pierce remained steady, never overbearing her presence, as quiet as the cup of coffee she'd slide toward me on difficult days. The hospital board issued a formal statement suspending my father indefinitely from all committees. His colleagues kept their distance conversations cut short when he entered a room. The man who once controlled so many doors now found them quietly closing. Word spread beyond the hospital. Invitations to long-standing social circles faded, friends excusing themselves from dinners they'd once begged to attend. The shine of his reputation dulled with every week. For my mother, the unraveling came differently. She left the house on the west side and moved into a modest apartment near downtown. Ruth told me she'd called more than once, her voice cracking as she admitted she'd started therapy. Her messages to me were shorter, not apologies exactly, but acknowledgments. I see what I didn't allow myself to see. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll listen. I read them without deleting, tucking the phone into my pocket, with a heaviness I didn't know how to name. One afternoon, Ruth and I sat in her kitchen as rain streaked the windows. The table was cleared of binders, now replaced with plates of fruit and steaming mugs of tea. She watched me over the rim of her cup. "You know, Nora, she said you've taken their story and made it your own. That's something they can't undo." Her words lingered softer than the evidence had been, but steadier too. Later that week, I walked into the hospital conference center to deliver my first official presentation since the court's decision. The slides projected across the screen fracture patterns, timelines, the subtle signs that so many clinicians overlook. I spoke about what had happened to me without naming it, framing each point as a reminder. Patients' stories don't always match their injuries, and silence doesn't mean safety. The room stayed quiet as I spoke, every eye on me. At the end, applause rose, not polite but sustained. Dr. Pierce gave me a small nod from the front row, pride written clearly in her expression. In the back, residents who had once kept their distance clapped the hardest, as if they knew what it meant to see one of their own stand tall. Outside the hall, I felt the shift settle deeper. This wasn't just about proving what had happened anymore. It was about transforming it into something larger, something that could shield others from carrying the same weight alone. Still, there were reminders of the fracture that remained. Leaving the hospital one evening, I spotted my mother near the edge of the lot, her coat pulled tight around her shoulders. She didn't approach, only watched as I walked to my car. When our eyes met, I saw the same fear I had glimpsed on her wrist that day outside the courthouse. For a moment, I thought she might speak, but she only lowered her gaze and turned away. Haley's absence was louder. Her name surfaced occasionally in updates from Julia mandatory counseling sessions, community service hours, but I had not seen her since the trial. Part of me waited for her shadow in familiar places, though the order kept her away. The distance felt like both safety and loss tangled together in ways I couldn't easily separate. The nights grew quieter at Ruth's. We cooked dinners together, filled the house with the smell of rosemary chicken or baked apples, and sometimes we didn't talk at all, letting the comfort of her home do the speaking. It was a different kind of healing one, not measured in documents or rulings, but in the rhythm of ordinary life returning piece by piece. The case had given me something I hadn't expected, not revenge, but the power to walk into each day without bowing my head. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but in my own life it meant something simpler, the ability to breathe without flinching, to stand without bracing for another blow. And as I settled into that new steadiness, I realized the hardest part wasn't over yet. Facing them in court had given me clarity. Facing what came next, choosing what to do with the remnants of family, was a question still waiting for an answer. The months that followed moved in a rhythm I hadn't known before. Mornings began with sunlight spilling across Aunt Ruth's kitchen, the smell of coffee filling the air instead of tension. My ribs had long since healed, but I still touched my side out of habit, as if reminding myself of what it had taken to stand here. The hospital no longer felt like a place I had to survive. I moved through its halls with a steadiness that surprised me, colleagues greeting me with warmth instead of whispers. Dr. Lawson checked in occasionally, reminding me that my position was secure, while Dr. Pierce kept offering her quiet support, always in the way that mattered most: steady presence, not grand gestures. One afternoon, I hung framed X-rays in my small office. They showed the fractures that once told my silence. Now they told survival. Beside them, I placed the letter confirming my acceptance into a trauma-informed care fellowship. It felt fitting that the same evidence once used to hold me down was now guiding my purpose forward. I carried that focus into my work. A young patient arrived one day with bruises that didn't match her story. She spoke of slipping on a counter edge, her voice halting, her eyes darting away. I recognized the look instantly. I lowered my clipboard, pulled up a chair, and softened my voice. "Sometimes injuries tell a different story than we're ready to share," I said. Her shoulders sagged, relief flooding her expression as she whispered the truth. In that moment, I understood that everything I had endured had given me language she could trust. Evenings became something I hadn't expected: gentle. Ruth invited friends over for dinner, and I found myself surrounded by people who didn't ask me to shrink or explain. Detective Hart came once case files tucked under her arm, though she left them unopened on the counter, and joined us at the table. Dr. Pierce arrived with her famous pie, and we laughed about how no one could ever make it the same way. I even began to notice how Ruth's neighbor Ethan, a physical therapist who had helped during my recovery, moved with an ease that carried no expectations. He pulled out my chair, touched my shoulder lightly, and left the choice of closeness in my hands. One evening, as we sat around Ruth's coastal dining table with the ocean visible through the windows, she raised her glass. To healing that comes from being truly seen and believed. The words wrapped around me like a blessing, and for the first time, I felt them settle fully. Then came the message I hadn't been sure I would ever read. My mother wrote to say she had moved into her own apartment, away from the house and away from my father. She admitted she had started therapy not asking for forgiveness, but leaving the door cracked. When you're ready, if you're ever ready. I sat with the words for a long time. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't always about letting someone back in. Sometimes it was about releasing yourself from carrying the weight of anger every day. That evening, Ruth and I walked along the beach. The waves chased our footprints, and the sky stretched wide with copper and gold light. She asked quietly if I had thought about answering my mother. I watched a gull dive and rise again, the horizon glowing. "I don't know yet," I said, and she nodded, understanding that some answers take time. Looking back now, I see that justice didn't come in one loud moment. It came in pieces, through evidence carefully kept, through voices that chose to stand beside mine, through the simple act of being believed. My family's silence had once shaped me, but it no longer defined me. What defines me now is the choice to keep telling the truth and to protect others who might still be waiting for their chance to speak. If you've ever carried a silence that felt too heavy, know this: you are not alone and your voice matters more than you think. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, share where you're listening from in the comments, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Your support helps these voices be heard.